the Northwest Ordinance, and so it was settled by largely the same people, and it was settled, around the same time, is that there's an intervening period where Michigan, for instance, got a huge influx of African American people from the South, and where Minnesota and Wisconsin didn't really, because they didn't have the large manufacturing centers. And so I think that kind of demographic migration also has a big effect on localizing, culture to the point where maybe Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota would be more similar if it weren't for that kind of intervening period.
That's a really good point, I think, and I think there is a distinction to be made between the industrial Midwest and the Corn Belt, right? The Rust Belt and the Corn Belt, even though they're both often called Midwest.
So what you guys are saying is that because there's a difference between states or would-be states with respect to who migrated to these areas, then you would be able to see like the difference in culture. Because I know Wisconsin took in a lot of Germans, I think. That's why they're known for their beer and cheese. Because I met a friend from University of Wisconsin.
Great cow country, just in general.
So they do have a lot of cows there, and they're very proud of it for reasons.
So it sounds like a good idea.
Well, I would be proud of it, too, if my state's, economy was founded on milk production, cheese production.
Are you proud of your Chesapeake crabs, Jacob?
No, because those are destroying the Chesapeake Bay. I'm proud of the Chesapeake Bay, but crabbing destroyed the ecosystem, so I'm not in favor of it, unfortunately.
Fair enough.
So what you're saying is then that because there is a difference of mixing cultures, there is now a difference between the cultures of each state.
Yeah, basically intervening demographic shifts have an outsized effect on what we today see as different cultural,
And I mean, you can actually see that in another part of the country, which is the Southwest. I mean, historically, the entire Southwest, including California, was Spanish. It was part of the
New Spain,
and then it became part of Mexico, and then we beat them in a war called the Mexican-American War, and took all that stuff, and then we bought a crappy piece of land for like $18 million, and that became part of Arizona and New Mexico. But those territories were distinctly for the longest time Spanish dominated, in terms of that, and then over the intervening years, it became distinctly more, I guess, Americanized. And now you see California is completely different from Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which, all used to be kind of part of the same thing, post parts of Mexico, and then weren't anymore. But then I guess Texas is a little bit of an odd example, because Texas and California, while both, similar in the origin of them, were radically different, I think, from the get-go. Because, Texas was a lot more, California was a lot more about the free working man running across the mountains to get to the gold, whereas Texas was we got farmland, let's work with it.
Yeah, Texas was a generation earlier, and I think there are notable differences from the beginning. Yeah. And again, that goes back to who settles it.
Right. Which, goes to kind of the next question I wanted to ask. What do you see as the major regional divides? Where are the fault lines in American regional culture? Because, people like to talk about the South and the Midwest and, the West Coast. But they aren't real. They're kind of these nebulous ideas. So, where's the transition point, between these different, for instance, the Midwest? I got to tell you, I have no idea where the Midwest starts. I just know that Joe is wrong somehow.
Excuse me?
So I'm pulling up the U.S. Census Bureau's regions.
Oh,
we can't go to legal definition.
The U.S. Census Bureau. You know what? People can look this up, and you can put this in the linked up. The U.S. Census Bureau's regions are the worst ever.
Are they arbitrary?
They're not arbitrary. They might have made sense to an extent, in 1943 or whatever, but they're terrible. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, here I'll kind of give.
Also, they're based on state lines, which is inherently a weak way to do it.
Well, I mean, it's what they have to do, but
yeah. Well, yeah.
I'll
But
give
the point
that's
is,
true because it's like
fundamentally
SoCal
it's
and
an
then the rest of California.
it's an
they have, like, way different cultures.
administrative thing,
Yeah.
not a really regional, like defining intrinsic regional.
Although I'll say it's kind of
prescriptive,
interesting.
not descriptive, is
Yeah.
what it is.
I'll
That's a
say
good way
it
to
is
put
kind
it.
of interesting that they've, I'm looking at the map right now that we'll put in the link dump. The southern region starts with Maryland and Delaware. And so my question is,
Maryland?
it starts with Maryland and
So
Delaware.
they're considering it from the Mason-Dixon line, which is
Yeah.
it's not the southern border of Pennsylvania, but it's close enough to be the southern border of Pennsylvania.
And speaking to something Joe mentioned earlier, Pennsylvania is included in the Northeast region.
Terrible decision.
So why, Joe, though? Why should Pennsylvania not be in the Northeast? Why is it not culturally similar to, say, New Jersey or New York?
We had an interesting discussion about this earlier, which was part of the thing that prompted this discussion. And what made that controversial is I said Pennsylvania was part of the Midwest. And I can already hear the screams of angry Nebraskans. Look, there's Philadelphia, right? And there's the area right around Philadelphia, and that belongs with Jersey and New York and all that stuff. But once you get further in, and especially once you cross the Alleghenies, like Pittsburgh is a completely different city. That whole area, it's solidly part of the Rust Belt, culturally, economically, much more similar to cities in Ohio and the rest of the Midwest than to Philadelphia. Now, the Midwest itself is kind of an iffy concept, and I think it goes back to that same Rust Belt, Corn Belt divide that people talk about. There are people who will claim that Ohio is barely Midwestern. They say like the Midwest is, basically the Corn Belt. They take only the Corn Belt definition. At which point I have to remind them that it's the Midwest.
Well, I mean, if we're talking geographically, the Midwest would be centered on Nebraska and Iowa. So if I'm trying to, understand your argument correctly, it's that there are two distinct subregions in the Midwest based on kind of an agricultural basis and an industrial or a post-industrial, kind of culture.
Very, very roughly, yeah. I think that's the most, and it's an interesting thing to think about how that origin came about culturally. How you lump in like Pittsburgh with Des Moines.
Well, I mean, my assumption is it's going to be access to the Great Lakes versus access to the Atlantic seaboard as your primary trade center.
That is a good point, and I think that is really what differentiates the industrial Midwest. But the thing is, and this is an interesting cultural thing because I'm having trouble explaining why, but I don't have it in me to deny like Iowa, and northern Missouri the title of Midwest. Because like I've like messed with Blake about this before, but St. Louis has southern influences, but it is a Midwestern city, and that is not nearly as Great Lake focused as Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Milwaukee.
Well, it's quite the opposite. I mean, Missouri
exactly.
makes its trade down to the Gulf of Mexico, primarily. So that's interesting.
It's an interesting divide, and it's definitely more of a cultural thing than it is a geographic or even an economical thing. But the Corn Belt and the Rust Belt, in my mind at least, are inseparable.
Okay, so if we're talking then about regionalism, kind of on that grand of a scale, because the region that you're kind of outlining stretches from the Alleghenies to the beginnings of the Rockies, right?
Well, I think if you're talking about the Midwest, we're talking about culture. I mean, when we talk about places like the Midwest, that's the same sort of level of thing as the South. Wouldn't you agree? Those are equivalent terms.
Right. They're equivalent.
So we're talking about like
sizes,
quarters of the country here, I think. If you want to get more specific, like you want to say, I don't know, Can you say the Piedmont region if you're talking about like Virginia to Georgia? Is there another word for that?
Actually, so I'm looking at a different map, not the same one, but is I think is actually very. I will slap this into the chat, and we shall.
Please do. I think that's a terrible map, but we'll talk about it.
Hey, we can talk about it. I think it's accurate, but I will explain why in a hot.
You can talk about subregions to be sure.
Okay, well, subregions I think are critically important because I would not regard.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
I would not regard the counties like in Virginia as anywhere same as the counties in Mississippi. We don't regard ourselves as the same. But here it like makes the distinction that there's the South Atlantic region to the south. Because when you think of like
Appalachia.
Now, I've just got to point out, and we'll drop this link, I'm sure, into the link dump. But I like the idea of the Tidewater, including Norfolk and the peninsula here.
I would agree with it too because
say
some
that
of the
town
other
name again?
A town. Norfolk is the biggest industrial city in the southern United States. It produces our Navy. It
Yeah,
is
it's
the
gotta be
bastion
Quantico.
Oh,
of
right.
American
It's Quantico.
freedom.
because I would not like.
No,
got
Quantico.
No,
like
Quantico is
300,000
just like
people. What kind of city is that?
is like 20 miles north of
pretty big.
DC.
No, see now
south
the
of DC.
incorporated city of Norfolk is different from the city itself. Includes a bunch of other kind of outlying.
For those who
areas,
don't
but-
understand, he's talking about the city Norfolk.
Yeah.
Fair enough, I guess. We had this fight about a city recently.
You guys actually have a fight? Like fisticuffs?
Yeah, we had It was Moscow. It was is Moscow the largest city in Europe?
Which
we had
it
a fight
isn't.
about this. Which it is.
Which it most certainly is not.
It
I have to
obvious-
say.
Okay, you know what? We'll fight more about this later.
But what I really like about this thing is that it actually indirectly separates kind of actual, like what we would call the Rust Belt, which this map refers to as the East Great Lakes, from the Heartland, which is then itself distinguished from the Midwest. Because they are all kind of different from each other.
Yeah.
From one and
Guys,
from
what are
one
the
another.
Ozarks? I've heard that term, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah, the Ozarks is an interesting kind of historical.
I would mix them in with the Appalachians, honestly. I
It's
think
it's
the only
smack
reason they're
dab
different
right there
is
in the map.
because
Yeah.
they're separated. But it's the same Scotch-Irish sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, the Ozarks are a mountain region kind of on the edge of the Midwest before the Great Plains basically start. And they were settled, I think, actually by settlers from Appalachia, like the same. But there's an intervening region, the Ohio River Valley, kind of is between the Appalachians and the Ozarks.
You know what? I have warmed to this map that, like, in general, I think there are some compelling things here. That said, there are some really, really screwy things here. I would
Some
say
really
as well.
fine distinctions that probably don't need to be there.
Well,
Austin,
like,
Texas.
Pittsburgh.
I mean,
mixed
Austin
in
is
with
not the
Appalachia.
same.
Like, really?
Well, no, they're saying they've got Pittsburgh actually as a separate entity.
Oh, is it? Are
Yeah.
those its own thing?
Yeah, so
Oh.
when you'll notice at the bottom left of the map, they've got like 1, 2, and 3, which are supposed to be distinct entities from whatever.
Well,
they're
I'd like to
inside.
say I find it, yeah.
Well,
These are
I
Virginia
would say
towns.
that like because like when you think of like Texas, you do not think it's exactly the same as like Alabama. Like they might have some similar things, but it's a little bit different from.
I mean, Texas is large enough, and I think it's had a long enough time to develop a distinct culture that now, if you say like Texan, there is a singular image of a Texan person. Whereas if I
Like
say
a howdy cowboy Texas.
yeah, somebody who wears cowboy boots. But if I said like Alabaman, you would just have an image of a generic Southern person.
Well, there are some specific stereotypes to Alabama, but we won't get into those. I think it's interesting about how far in and out you zoom when you're talking about distinctions, because, like, yeah, the difference between a Texan and like Deep South is evident in my mind. But like I can also think of a serious distinction between like Cleveland, Akron area and Indiana, right? But that's probably not as clear.
No, that's not clear at all to me, for instance.
To somebody from outside. So that's an interesting thing. I wonder.
Which I
It
guess
probably has to do with that
yeah.
same thing we were talking about, like how it's hard to see regions when you're not as plugged into the culture. Like it was before I came here, I could not have told you the difference between the Tidewater and the rest of like Central Virginia.